Before we get into creating environments using BSP brushes or static meshes, we need to go through and cover how environments are created in UE4. This will give you a better idea of what to use and at which point of the production process. So in UE4, there are 3 ways to create geometry. And by geometry, I mean any physical boundaries of the world, such as architecture or props. The 3 ways are BSP brushes, static meshes, and landscape. So let's cover each of them one by one. The first is BSP brushes. These are simple geometric primitive shapes that can be created right inside UE4 editor. You'll find BSP brushes in the Modes panel under Place tab and Geometry. And you'll have a set of primitive BSP brushes that you could use. So brushes are very fast to add and iterate right inside the editor. Although BSP can get very slow if a lot of brushes are used, which can decrease performance, especially when compared to static meshes. And for that, BSP is not intended as final in-game geometry. With many older game engines, BSP is what was used to create everything with, including final in-game geometry. But with current game engines, including UE4, that's no longer the case. And I will show you the standard level workflow to use, but right now, you should know that BSP is only used during a certain phase of production, during the beginning blockout stages. BSP also lacks the detail that static meshes provide, and we'll cover static meshes next. So BSP is great for prototyping and blocking out a level, but in the end, you want to limit how much BSP you have in the final level. Now with static meshes, these are 3D models created in 3D modeling software such as Maya LT, Maya, 3ds Max, Modo, Blender, and many others. And then they are imported into UE4. Static meshes are far more efficient for performance than BSP brushes. Static meshes are more detailed than BSP. Static meshes can be used with Blueprint and can be used as dynamic objects. Static meshes are also instanced by the hardware whenever you reuse them, which is very good for performance. And static meshes should be your final in-game level geometry, and they should replace all of your BSP brushes. Then we have landscape. Landscape is a terrain system in UE4. It's created inside the editor, and you'll find it in the Modes panel, shortcut Shift 3. Or it can be generated outside UE4 using external software, and then imported into UE4. Landscapes are very optimized, and they can be used to create huge worlds. And landscapes are often used alongside static meshes, such as rocks, trees, grass, and plants. We are not going to focus on how to create landscape in this series, and it will be done so in its own tutorial series. Now let's cover a standard level creation workflow. This is an overview, but it will be close to what you follow as you create your environments. First, you'll block out the level with BSP brushes. You focus on scale, size, establishing proper proportions, level layout and flow, and integrating gameplay. During this first step, you are prototyping and establishing what your environment is going to look like with simple geometry. And it's recommended that you only use BSP brushes, since you can change, update, iterate, and playtest very quickly. Then once you begin to narrow down and lock your layout, then you move on to static meshing. This is where you replace the BSP brushes with static meshes, and you make the level pretty. This is the art pass. Then you do a lighting pass, where you begin to add lights, and do a level polish pass, where you work on post-process, add audio, particle effects, and you take your level to a complete finished stage. So by the time you are done, you will end up replacing all your BSP brushes with static meshes. And it's recommended that you only use BSP brushes for block and audio level, and eventually replace everything with static meshes. And it's very common to have 100% static meshes in your final level. So let me show you a couple of examples of finished work that was done by Epic Games in some of their project example files. The first one is from Content Examples, which can be downloaded from the Learn tab. Inside the Maps folder, I'm going to open up Level Design Workflow level. And then here is a good example of the entire process pipeline of creating a level. You have your prototype pass or the blockout pass. Then you have your static meshes pass, lighting pass, and polish pass. And if we go into the prototype or the blockout pass, everything in here is BSP brushes. And you can see that the entire space was created and blocked out using nothing else but BSP brushes. This is where you determine scale, judge proportion, establish correct architecture dimensions, integrate gameplay, scripting, and get the environment working just with BSP brushes. And then once you're done, you would move on to the static mesh pass. And here you can see that everything was replaced with static meshes. So the framework of the level is still the same. And we do not have any more BSP brushes here. They were all replaced with static meshes. And to show you for sure, if we go to the Show tab and then disable static meshes, so they're no longer shown in the viewport, all we are left with is the prototype blockout pass. And that's where all the BSP brushes are at. But everything else uses static meshes. And then you have your lighting pass, where you focus on lighting your environment. And then you finish it up with a polish pass by adding effects, reflections, audio, post-process, and finishing the level. Then let me quickly show you two more examples. The second example is from Blueprints project, which can also be downloaded from the Learn tab. In the Blueprint Office map, if I go ahead and disable the visibility of all static meshes, again you can see that this final level contains no BSP brushes. But I can guarantee that this map was started off with the blockout phase, where BSP brushes were used to block everything in and to test blueprints or integrated gameplay. And then working through the process, the BSP brushes were replaced with static meshes. And then the last example is from the shooter game. And again, this is available for you to download through the Learn tab. And in this project, this main map also contains no BSP brushes in its final level. But to create something this grand, something this big and detailed, it had to be started with just simple primitive geometry using BSP brushes, where it can be changed, updated, iterated, and playtested on the fly in real time. And once the gameplay, the level layout, flow, and all of its architecture were locked down, then everything was replaced and detailed with static meshes. So it's important that I show you all these examples so you know what it takes to create final levels, and that BSP is an essential part of this process that you begin to create with. But in the end, everything gets replaced with static meshes, and your level ends up containing almost zero BSP brushes. So to finish up this video, let's go through the benefits of using BSP brushes and static meshes, as well as their downsides. The benefits of BSP brushes is that they are simple geometric primitive shapes and are entirely created and used inside UE4 editor. Because of this, they're very fast to add, to iterate, and to block in your layout. This way, you're not focused on any detailing, but just to block in the layout. BSP is great as placeholder geometry. And due to all this, BSP is perfect for prototyping and blocking out your initial level your initial environment. The downsides of BSP brushes is that they're very slow if a lot of brushes are used, so this will affect performance. BSP brushes are not optimized to be final in-game geometry. Also, there's no way to control edges on BSP brushes, so they're always going to be hard edges. BSP lacks detail that static meshes provide. You have no control how lighting is handled on BSP brushes, other than light map resolution. You have no control of how BSP brushes are rendered. And it's difficult and simply not practical to create high quality detailed geometry with BSP brushes. Now you can still have BSP brushes in your final level, as long as you keep these brushes to a minimum and as very simple geometric shapes. I recommend to keep static meshes to BSP ratio using the following: 70-30, 80-20, 90-10, with the higher number being your static meshes. But your goal should always be to be at near 100% static meshes for your final level. The benefits of static meshes is that they're more memory and performance efficient. You can have thousands of static meshes being used all over your environment, and your level will work and play just fine. But you should never have that many brushes. Even having 100 brushes in your final level is probably too much. Static meshes offer more detail than BSP ever could. Static meshes are instanced by the hardware across the level wherever they are used, so this is very good for performance. Static meshes can be used with blueprints and as dynamic objects. The downside of static meshes, and there aren't many, is that it takes time to create them. You have to model them, UV them, texture them, set up level of detail, create collisions, light map. So it requires 3D software and requires 3D software knowledge. So the main takeaway is that you use BSP brushes to prototype and to block out your level. You should always do this with everything you create. And then you will end up replacing all the BSP brushes with static meshes. So now that you know the process, we're gonna go through how to use BSP brushes, how to create with them, and how to insert and use static meshes.